What's going on? My name's Jay, and today I'm going to show you the 3 camera settings that you need to focus on in order to properly expose your videos. Let's take a look. One of the most important things that you need to do in order to get good looking video is properly expose your shots. Doing this is going to make it easier to color correct, color grade, and it's just going to make your video look better than the other guys. Now, in order to properly expose our shots, we need to focus on 3 specific camera settings: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, otherwise known as the exposure triangle. Let's take a look at these one by one so we know exactly what they do. First, let's talk about shutter speed, which is exactly what it sounds like. The faster your shutter speed, the faster your shutter opens and shuts. Now, this is a lot more important for photography than it is for video, but we'll get into that later. For now, just know that shutter speed, the faster your shutter speed, the less light is hitting your sensor. Cool? Moving on. Your aperture is a mechanism inside of your lens that controls how much light is going through your lens and hitting the camera sensor. Now, your aperture also controls your depth of field. So jumping back to photography, if you're doing portrait shots and you want that nice shallow depth of field, that nice bokeh effect, then you're gonna wanna open your aperture up as wide as it can go. On the other hand, if you're doing, let's say, landscape photography, you want everything to be sharp and you want that nice deep depth of field, you're gonna actually wanna close your aperture. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind with aperture is everything's kind of in reverse, meaning the lower your f-stop number, the more light is going to be going through the lens and hitting your sensor, the more open your aperture is going to be. On the other hand, the higher your f-stop number, the more closed your aperture is going to be and the less light's going to be passing through the lens and hitting the sensor. So if you're shooting in, let's say, low light, something like this lens, the 50mm 1.8, which has a nice wide open aperture, is going to be exactly what you're looking for. Now let's look at ISO or ISO, which deals with your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. Basically, the more sensitive your camera sensor is to light, the brighter your image is gonna be, the higher your exposure is gonna be. But you have to be careful with this because if you crank that ISO too much, you're gonna get a lot of noise in your video. And we're gonna talk about that in just a little bit. But first, now that we know what all of these things do, let's take a look at how to set your shutter speed and your aperture and your ISO in order to get a properly exposed shot. The first thing that we're gonna do is set our shutter speed. And when it comes to video, if you're looking for something that's more realistic, if you're trying to make a video that kind of looks similar to what the naked eye would see, then you're gonna wanna use something called the 180-degree rule, which means that your shutter speed is as close to double or, exactly double your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second like I normally do, I'm gonna wanna set my shutter speed as close to 48 as I could get it. And if I'm doing slow motion at 60 frames per second, I want that shutter speed to be as close to 120 as I can get it. You get the idea. Now, once we have our shutter speed set, we need to look at our aperture. And for this, we don't necessarily need to think about, how much light do I need unless you're shooting in low light. What we really need to think about is, what are we filming? Are we doing a close-up of our characters? Great, open that aperture wide up. Are we doing something of some landscape? Okay, let's close that aperture off a little bit. You need to set your aperture based on what you're actually trying to shoot to get the look that you want. This is all making sense, right? I got a poll right here. Let's answer that. Let me know that you're following along. Now, before I jump into ISO, I feel like I should tell you that most cameras, if not all cameras, have a built-in exposure meter that looks something like this. Now, if that little arrow is over to the left a little bit, then your shot is underexposed. And if it's over to the right, it's overexposed. You want to try and get that arrow as close to the middle as possible. But little pro tip, if you have to choose between underexposed and overexposed, go underexposed. It's a lot easier to recover details from the shadows than it is to recover them for the highlights. Okay, now that we have our shutter speed and our aperture set, it's time to use ISO to get those final little tweaks in order to get a properly exposed shot. Now, remember earlier when I said that if you crank that ISO up too high, you're gonna get a lot of noise in your video? That is very, very true. So in order to get a good looking video with not a lot of noise, you wanna keep that ISO down as far as you can while still getting a properly exposed shot. Now, one of the easiest ways to do this is with lighting. If you wanna learn more about how to properly light your videos, check out this video right here. And if you wanna learn more about video editing, camera gear, and how to make better videos, make sure that you subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for hanging out, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Go watch now.